Got a question here from Evan. Evan asks, I finally switched over full-time to Linux. Yay! How much power and influence do open source foundations have? And how much does it affect me as a consumer of open source software? First off, welcome to the club, Evan. Welcome to Club Linux. You'll find the waters here to be overall warm and relaxing. As for the question of how much influence various foundations actually have in the open source free software and Linux world, well, that's a tricky question that will take us meandering through the wilderness for a bit. And there are lots of landmines hidden just about everywhere. The short, highly unsatisfactory answer is that they have a huge amount of control and influence. Influence that you, as a user of the software, will hopefully never have to see. Unfortunately, their invisible influence is becoming increasingly visible and, for lack of a better word, influential. Now, when we talk about such foundations and similar types of organizations, really four of them jump immediately to mind: the Free Software Foundation, the Linux Foundation, the Open Source Initiative, and the Software Freedom Conservancy. Realistically, there are many others: the Document Foundation, the Apache Foundation, the GNOME Foundation, the Mozilla Foundation, most of which tend to focus on a narrow set of projects and pieces of software, essentially ways of organizing and funding their development, promotion, and support. Now, those four, the FSF, the Linux Foundation, the OSI, and the SFC, the Software Freedom Conservancy, have a huge amount of influence over the broader open software world in various ways. The Free Software Foundation and the Software Freedom Conservancy, in my mind, are the most direct and focused of those four. Their missions are easy to understand and very to the point. They tend to not get bogged down and sidetracked. Not always the case, but usually. The FSF is at its core the publishers and maintainers of the free software definition. All other work they do tends to be focused on promoting the ideas behind free software, funding development, and pushing campaigns that they see as related to their core mission. For example, they tend to fight rather vigorously against ideas like digital rights management, DRM, and surveillance, among other campaigns. In this way, the FSF has a major impact in setting both tone and direction for many other organizations within the quote-unquote open world. Their voice is listened to and their statements have an impact. With the somewhat forced departure of their founder, Richard Stallman, it will be interesting to see if their voice will continue to carry that same weight going forward. Now, the Software Freedom Conservancy has a very similar focus: promote, develop, support, and defend free or Libre software. They also provide infrastructure and legal services for an absolutely huge number of free software projects. I link to all of these things that I'm talking about here over the article version of this show at the Lunduke Journal at lunduke.com if you'd like to click on this and see all the details. They also have a tendency to take active roles in legal issues. They feel directly impact their ideology, free software, privacy, that sort of thing. In those ways, the impact of the SFC is far-reaching. If they were to disappear tomorrow, many projects would face tremendous difficulty in their day-to-day operations. The work they do cannot be understated, and thus the dependency many have on them is worth noting as well. Now, as just a side note here, I tend to be a big fan of the SFC, the Software Freedom Conservancy, and their work. However, their power and the weight of their voice is sometimes used in ways that divide and attack portions of the free software world, such as when the SFC joined in the mob-like attacks on Richard Stallman during 2019. Worth noting, I have many criticisms of Richard Stallman and have voiced them over the years, rather publicly. I got yelled at many times for voicing such criticisms. But the SFC's attacks on Stallman, considering the important role they play and their close relationship with the Free Software Foundation, were particularly cruel and harmful to both the community and the free software movement. All that said, overall, I would say that the work of both the FSF and the SFC are clear, direct, and supportive of free software. easy to understand and evaluate. For both the Linux Foundation and the Open Source Initiative, things get much less clear, more murky. Let's start with the Linux Foundation. The Linux Foundation's mission is stated as, and I quote, building sustainable ecosystems around open source projects to accelerate technology development and industry adoption. And that is something that they absolutely demonstrably do. And depending on how you measure things, they do it with great success. And we're not just talking about the Linux kernel here. They employ the founder and maintainer of the Linux kernel, Linus Torvalds, as well as others. The Linux Foundation is an association of corporations who fund initiatives and sub-foundations that they have an interest in. Those include, but are not limited to, Kubernetes, Zen, Let's Encrypt, Node.js, Tizen. The number of Linux Foundation projects is vast and growing, and I have a link to their project page there on the article, lunduke.com, if you'd like to peruse it. It's impressive. Now, as of 2017, the Linux Foundation reported revenue north of $81 million US, roughly 20 million, up roughly 20 million, an increase of 20 million from the year prior in 2016, which in turn was also up roughly $20 million from the year before that, 2015. To say the Linux Foundation is growing rapidly, both in terms of revenue and project control and scope, would be a vast understatement. Now, this income comes from a combination of member companies who pay the Linux Foundation for involvement in their work, such as paying to gain a voting seat on their board, which many do, and from donations by individuals. Now, member companies of the Linux Foundation, member companies who pay the Linux Foundation to be a part, include Microsoft, Google, AT&T, IBM, Oracle, VMware, Huawei, WeBank, Adobe, Airbus, ADP, American Express, Capital One, Comcast, FedEx, Goldman Sachs, Netflix, PayPal, and so many others. Almost too many to even comprehend. Now, some of these companies have an obvious interest in the success of both Linux and related open source and free software projects. Others have a long-standing competition with Linux and free software. Others still have a very unclear interest in such projects. Now, an interesting side note, at least I think it's interesting. When an individual makes a donation to the Linux Foundation, not one penny goes towards Linux development. According to the Linux Foundation, and I quote, 100% of donations received go towards funding diversity programs. Funding of things like Linux kernel development actually comes through the corporate membership dues. At least that is my understanding. That's a fascinating thing. I know people who have donated to the Linux Foundation and none of their money goes towards Linux. It's fascinating. Now, the board of the Linux Foundation is made up of representatives from Microsoft, Comcast, Huawei, Facebook, Google, and many others. These are some of the companies that have influence and voting control within the Linux Foundation. Now, what does that mean for the influence those companies have over, say, Linux kernel development and work on many other projects that the Linux Foundation runs? And that's a good question. And honestly, I don't have a direct or clear answer to that. Does it concern me? You bet it does. As does the lack of transparency overall. Now, one way the Linux Foundation has a direct impact is with the overall community of developers and enthusiasts, as well as folks who might work within the industry. When people get banned from Linux Foundation-run events and conferences for what appear to be political motives, but refuse to talk with the press or community about it, that raises red flags. And I link to the article, the Lunduke Journal article, where I cover exactly such an event. Control over who can participate, both as a hobbyist and professionally, within the Linux and open source world is deeply concerning. Which finally brings us to the Open Source Initiative. Now, the OSI has a very simple, very narrow focus. And now, to be clear, I like a good, simple, narrow, focused foundation. I like that. That focus is this: to evaluate and endorse open source licenses that it feels meet the standards of the open source definition, which they are the maintainers of. The value here is that a company or project can make sure that a license they select for any given piece of software is one that has been researched, evaluated, and will hopefully be acceptable to other companies and individuals working in the open source space. It's logical, it's reasonable, limited. Now, their annual budget is significantly smaller than the other organizations on this list, which makes sense considering their scope. It's about $200,000 yearly. They do accept funding from companies such as Microsoft, but again, that funding is limited. The influence that the OSI has is, for the most part, strictly limited to what licenses get listed on their approved list. If licenses get approved that cause potential difficulties or encourage discrimination or limitations of usage, such as what is currently being proposed by some in the ethical software development movement, which has the goal of forbidding people from using software if those people are ones that the author of the software disagrees with politically, that could have potentially problematic impacts on both developers and end users. Though honestly, if the OSI were to move down a path where they endorse problematic, restrictive, or discriminatory licenses, the OSI simply will cease to be relevant or useful, thus solving any problem that could arise by that sort of action. Whew. So there we have it. The foundations do indeed have a lot of influence over the free and open source software world, and that influence appears to be increasing at a dramatic rate. Some of that influence demonstrably brings about positive results. Other results are less positive. But the level of influence is undeniable. Now, how does any of this impact you, an end user of such software? The reality is, if you do not work within the software industry or related industries, that influence isn't typically felt. The impact on you is farther downstream. What does have a huge and noteworthy impact on end users are the goals and directions of some of the major open source focused companies, especially Red Hat. But that is a topic for a different day. That was a great question. Thank you so much, Evan, for that one, and thank you to all the supporters of the Lunduke Journal. If you want to join in the crew, the hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of you that's helped support the Lunduke Journal and keep the lights on here and support what I do, going over to lunduke.com is to support the Lunduke Journal link. You can support a variety of different ways, whatever way you decide to support. It's amazing, and a huge shout out to Linode. The Lunduke Journal would not be possible without the support of Linode. Linode provides some of the awesomest Linux server hosting in the world. If you go to linode.com/Lunduke or go to just about any of the articles on lunduke.com and click on the Linode link, you get a $20 credit for signing up, which you can use to fund quite a bit of services over at Linode. It's absolutely amazing. Set up a nice little Linux server, run a MUD on it, run a BBS, run a file host, just run a box that you can SSH into from any computer in the world just to have one to use and play around with. Run a WordPress blog, whatever you feel like doing. All right, everybody. Thank you for sending this question in. Again, if you'd like to send in questions to the Lunduke Journal, you can send them in. My email address is simply brian@lunduke.com. There's links over at the Lunduke Journal, lunduke.com. And I will see you guys later.